All right, for the sake of time, why don't I get started? I hope that everyone can hear me, and if you want to give a thumbs up or throw a signal in the chat to the hosts, let us know if you can't hear, or if you are having trouble seeing seeing our screen. I did see a hand raised. Please throw a note in the chat or a question in the box if you're having a problem seeing our screen or hearing me. But I'm going to run through some quick introductions for the webinar today, and then I'll turn it over to our presenters. We'll save time for discussion at the end, and then wrap up with a few quick updates. So today's Adaptation in Action webinar series is focused on adaptive forest management with Dr. Jamie Mosel from our own University of Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership, and then Dr. Lucia Fitz from the University of Minnesota's Department of Forest Resources. Before we get started, I just want to share a couple of upcoming events. First of all, these webinars are monthly. Hopefully most of you are on our email list and you get notices about the webinar series, or you follow us on social media where we always post our webinars. But next month, on the third Tuesday of the month, we will present on Climate Forward, our report that we created with HGA architecture and engineering firm about climate data use by architectural and engineering professionals, and some strategies that we might be able to use to improve climate data use for architecture and engineering design. And then the other big event that we will continue to promote is that the Midwest Climate Resilience Conference will be upcoming in October 25th through 27th at Duluth at the DEC, Duluth Entertainment and Convention Center, right on the waterfront. So we hope to see many of you there. Here in just the next week or so, we will send out our request for proposals for that conference and get the website up and running and start opening up registration and hotels for the conference. And then the last thing is we have our downscale climate data app that is soon to come online. Next week on Friday, Jamie and I will be working through a beta test with some of our first users and working with them to understand how we can do some final improvements to the downscale data app, and then some things that we need to pay specific attention to in training people. And then we'll start to move out into greater Minnesota, offering training around how to use our new downscale climate data app for various purposes. So please stay tuned to climate.umn.edu or extension.umn.edu to learn more about those trainings. And a few friendly reminders about the webinar today. We will end promptly at 1 p.m. All of the participants will be muted during the presentation because this is a webinar, but we do have the Q&A box, and we hope you'll use that often, both to submit questions to our presenters, but also you can like questions to show us that you would really like to see us prioritize answering those. The webinar is being recorded, and we will share that on MCAP's YouTube channel shortly after the event. And just a quick note, here's how you can submit questions. So just click that Q&A button that you should see in your toolbar, and then again you can type your question, or you can like to tell us that you'd really like to have a question answered. Of course, you can also raise your hand at any time if there's something that you need to address, or you should be able to type a chat to those of us who are presenting and hosting the webinar, especially if you need help with something you can't hear or you can't see something well. Let us know and we'll do our best to help you. So with that, I am going to briefly introduce Dr. Jamie Mosel, who is a climate extension educator with our University of Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership. She's part of a new and growing group of extension educators that we're hiring to work with agricultural, natural resources, and other audience groups all over the state to help them make climate-informed decisions. And then Dr. Lucia Fitz is a postdoctoral associate in the University of Minnesota's Department of Forest Resources, working on adaptive silviculture for climate change and adaptive silvicultural management. So with that, I will turn it over to both of you to give a more robust introduction and dive into your slides. I'll stop sharing.
Thanks, Nate. I'll pull up my slides here. There we go. Can you see it all? And you can hear me okay? Perfect. Well, thanks, Nate, for introducing us. Yeah, I'm Jamie Mosel, and I'm super excited to be here today to talk about adaptive forest management. And I'm really happy to be here with Lucia. She is a longtime friend and has helped me a ton with the research that I'm going to talk about, not to mention with the research she's going to talk about herself. And so, yeah, thanks, Lucia, for being here. I always like to take a moment at the start to express gratitude, acknowledgement, and commitment. So we are on the past, present, and future lands of the Anishinaabe, Dakota, and other indigenous nations throughout what's now known as the United States, and here in Minnesota, Anishinaabe, Minnesota, Makoche. And on the bottom left is a map made by Marlena Miles, showing culturally significant areas in the Twin Cities region to the Dakota. And then on the right is a map actually from the northern Minnesota, from the Boundary Waters area. It was a collaboration with Boys Fort and the Ely Folk School. So you can check that out actually at their website, but it's showing Ojibwe-Moan or Ojibwe language names for many of those lakes. And to start off with, the topics that we'll be going through today is, first I'll give a little intro to climate change and forest impacts, and then I'll move into some examples from research. So this is what I did my PhD on, and I'll share a little bit of those findings on adaptive silviculture for climate change, and then some on warming impacts on seedlings. And then I'll switch over to Lucia at that point, and she'll talk about the state of the practice, adaptation plantings in the Great Lakes, and then some examples from those projects. And like Nate mentioned, I'm Jamie. I'm a new extension educator for climate resilience. My background is in climate change and forest science. And Lucia Fitz is a postdoc here at the U of M. Her background is in forestry, climate adaptation plantings, like she'll talk about, and actually a lot of knowledge about GIS. So yeah, I encourage you to check out her dissertation as well. So why adaptive forest management? Well, we're really seeing impacts of climate change on forests and expecting to see more. So adaptive forest management is a way that we can tackle some of those issues and be proactive. Many of you might know that forests can act as carbon sinks, but forests face climate stressors just like the rest of us. Things like heat waves and drought, even flooding can cause stress. And so those reduce forests' ability to act as carbon sinks. And in those situations, forests can actually become sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So forests face things like drought, which can in some cases lead to wildfire. It can make trees more vulnerable to pests and pathogens, all sorts of things like this. And then looking specifically at things like drought, when we take a look at drying soil moisture, that can also reduce carbon uptake. So this figure is by Green et al. From 2019. On the y-axis, you can see net biome productivity. So net biome productivity is the carbon fluxes due to net primary production. So that's photosynthesis minus respiration costs. And the flux is due to land use and land cover change. And when we look at that out through time, so it's time on the x-axis out to the end of the century, that black line is positive. But when we factor in things like the blue line, which is soil moisture variability, the red line, which is the drying soil moisture trend, and then the combined pink line, that's the combination of soil moisture variability and the drying trend, that's pretty consistently negative. And we've also seen observations of global tree mortality, especially from hotter droughts. So hotter droughts are what you might think they are. We've always had droughts, but as we face warming, those droughts are getting more severe and more intense. And that has resulted in tree mortality in regions across the globe. That figure on the left is showing places where that's been observed. And then on the right, it's showing how this mortality is really dispersed across all sorts of forest biomes. So it's not necessarily one forest type that's getting mortality. We've seen it across the board. There are certainly some regions that are facing more. And then zooming in to here in Minnesota. So Minnesota is already warmed. Our average annual temperature has increased nearly 3 degrees Fahrenheit since the late 1800s. This figure is showing observations of temperature change from 1895 up until 2019. And you can see here in Minnesota that orange and especially that dark red color, that's a pretty considerable change, especially northern Minnesota, that Grand Rapids area, that dark red. That area has seen change that's compared to the rest of the state and even nationally pretty considerable. And then as we look to the future, Minnesota is projected to continue warming. So this figure is showing the Midwest projected increases in annual average temperature by mid-century compared to 1971 to 2000. And this projection uses global climate models that assume emissions of heat-trapping gases continue to rise. And what we can see here is temperature increases, like in Minnesota, are especially severe in northern regions of the Midwest. Those temperature changes and other impacts associated with climate change also affect our forested landscapes. So we've already seen shifts in some of the tree species that are thriving and declining or not doing so well. And looking into the future, this figure is showing on the left, the current distribution of forest types in the Great Lakes region. In the middle, into the future under a low emission scenario. And on the far right, under a high emission scenario. And one thing I especially want to highlight is here in Minnesota, we are really lucky. We have a lot of different ecotones and forest types. In northern Minnesota, that's the temperate boreal transition zone. What I've circled now is that region in our current distribution. That's things like spruce fir forest. When we move into a low emission scenario, that region is really shrinking. And then when we look in far right under a high emission scenario, there's potential to lose that boreal temperate transition area altogether and shifting into something potentially like an oak hickory forest type. And if you've been in that area, that's a pretty big change. That's very different from what we see now. So that's concerning. At the same time, that trajectory really does depend on climate mitigation and adaptations we take now. So Lucia will talk about adaptation plantings, for example. That's a really important proactive action we can take now that will impact the distributions of forest types that we see in the future. Same with climate mitigation actions. The more we can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, the less impact we'll have on our forested landscapes. And this is a figure from Lee Freilich showing that change, potential change here in Minnesota as well. So on the left side in green, that's today showing forest compatible biomes. And under our current CO2 concentration, 408 parts per million. And just to put that in perspective, so when I was in college, 400 parts per million was the high level of CO2 that we typically saw in experiments. And then on the right, that's in 50 years. showing in red, shifting to more of a prairie biome under a high emissions scenario. And that's in particular if we get warmer temperatures and continue our current emission rates. This figure isn't showing, yes, for sure there will be prairies here. Like I said, it really does depend on our actions today. All it's showing is that that's area that's previously wasn't really compatible with prairies and could shift to that. So now I'm going to go into an example from my PhD research. This is the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change experiment. So the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change experiment, we sometimes refer to it as ASK, is a national network of experimental sites looking at ways that we might be able to cope with climate change and manage our forests. All of the sites use some combination of these strategies on the screen: resistance, resilience, and transition. So resistance is improving forest defenses against predicted changes or disturbance to maintain relatively unchanged conditions. So here in Minnesota, that might look like in the Chippewa National Forest, typically red pine stands, thinning those down a little bit to buffer against things like drought. When we look at resilience, that's accommodating some change, but encouraging a return to a prior or desired reference condition following disturbance. So basically trying to bounce back. Here in Minnesota, what that looks like at the Chippewa National Forest is promoting more heterogeneity across the landscape. So maybe having some areas that are more dense, some areas that are more open, and planting a variety of different native species to hedge your bets against what we might face in the future. Then the transition is the more dramatic response. So that's facilitating change and encouraging ecosystems to adaptively respond to new or changing conditions. So this is acknowledging that potentially in the future, that forest type might not do well in that area, and that this is allowing that forest to shift into something new. And it may not be what we saw in the future, but hopefully it will preserve some of those ecological functions that the previous forest type served. And like I mentioned, this is actually a national and international network of sites. We've got sites across the United States here and moving into Canada as well. And those sites are continuing to grow and more are popping up. Here in Minnesota, as I mentioned, I worked at the Chippewa National Forest during my PhD. That's in northern Minnesota, in Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe lands. We also have another experiment, so we're really lucky we have two of these here in Minnesota. The one on the right is the Mississippi National River Area site in the Crosby Farms Regional Park. So that's more local to you guys in the Twin Cities, and you can check it out here. But at the Chippewa National Forest site, that's about 500 acres. It's in north central Minnesota near Leech Lake and Lake Winnipegashish. And it's actually the first installation of this network. Just to orient you a little bit more, like I said, the Chippewa National Forest, north central Minnesota. And it's also located right in the middle of the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe Reservation. So it's really important when we're talking about climate adaptation that we recognize where that is and the history of that land, and be intentional about including tribes in this process. So tribes have really been on the front lines of climate change, both in terms of the impacts, but also in terms of trying to adapt and mitigate and push against that, those climate impacts. So one of the motivations for my research at this site was is kind of summarized by this figure. So thinning or reducing stand density may help tree survival during drought. There's been research to show this. A lot of times forest managers will thin. So it's been known that thinning can help boost the forest responses to certain stressors. So this figure is showing on the y-axis probability of surviving drought, and then on the x-axis growing space. So basically how much space those trees have for themselves. And so my question was, will those adaptive management treatments, like the transition strategy, help reduce negative impacts of drought, like we're seeing in some of these experiments? So as you go left to right, that probability of surviving drought increases with the more growing space that those trees have. To do this, instead of waiting for a drought, which can be kind of hard and difficult to capture scientifically, we used a rainout shelter. So these are basically greenhouse roofs that helped us reduce rainfall by about 60%. And we use these strategically all season, in the early part of the summer, the second half of the summer, and then we also had controls that didn't have any rainfall reduction. And you can dig into more of these results in, this is my dissertation, it's publicly available, but I'll go over some highlights here today. So one thing that was really interesting to find was, this is soil moisture at 1 meter depth. And this, it's in the red is the control. So those are really dense sites, unthinned, kind of the condition that things are in that region if they're unthinned or unmanaged. And then the blue is the transition. So the really heavily thinned or less dense stands. And you can see that consistently, this is 2019 on the left and 2020 on the right. Those transition treatments that are less dense have more soil moisture available. And then when we look at things like seedling relative growth rates, these are their diameters. So I planted 5 different species in these at these sites. And we can see at the controls, the response to drought is pretty stepwise. Lowest diameters for the longest period of drought for the whole season, going up to without being droughted. Then when we look at our transitions, it was actually surprising to see a different pattern. So instead of that stepwise pattern, it looks like at the transitions, late season or rainfall reduction, potentially drought occurring later in the season, had a more severe effect on seedling growth rates. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the impacts of warming on seedling growth and phenology. So this is actually based at a different experiment. The B4 warmed experiment. So boreal forest warming at an ecotone in danger. And these experiments are located in Cloquet and Ely. So that's that area that's spanning the temperate to boreal forest transition zone. And this study used underground heating cables and above ground heat lamps to simulate different levels of warming and those impacts on trees. It started around 2008 with about 11 temperate and boreal species planted. And these species represent a range of latitude and species ranges. And work from this site, this is work by Lee Freilich, Rebecca Montgomery, and Peter Reich, has suggested that our boreal species may not fare well as temperatures continue to warm, especially summer temperatures, especially compared to species like red maple or sugar maple. So you can see as the temperatures warm, those red maple and sugar maples seem to be growing better in height. Balsam fir, white spruce, not as much. With my research, I looked at shoot extension. So the seedlings shoots starting to grow in the beginning of the spring under those warming treatments. And the key takeaway was overall, those shoots were starting to extend earlier in the warming treatments. So we can see ambient plus 1.7 degrees Celsius and plus 3.4 degrees Celsius. Those are getting earlier in the spring when they're starting to extend their shoots. At the same time, we also found there was an earlier end of shoot extension in the warming experiments. So these boxes look the same pretty much because in the highest level of warming, it's starting to end growth sooner. Because of that overall, since the shoots stopped extending earlier in the season, the number of days that those seedling shoots were actually growing didn't increase significantly under warming. And that's something that's really important to find, because a lot of times we think, well, it's getting warmer, our growing season is extending, maybe that means trees are going to grow for longer, or maybe sequester more carbon. But in this case, at least for shoot extension, that may not be what's happening. But then we looked at mean shoot lengths of those seedlings. So while they didn't grow for longer, maybe they grew longer in height. So they were slightly longer in the closed canopy conditions, so under a forest canopy, but not when it was in the open. And neither of these were statistically significant. And then even more concerning is when we look at the rainfall reduction. So there's a rainfall reduction treatment embedded in the swarming experiment, which is pretty cool. Those are the gray bars here. Those under rainfall reduction, that shoot length was lower. So if we do see things like drought or dry conditions, even if shoot lengths can grow longer under warmer conditions, it may not actually happen if we have dry conditions. And then this figure is just showing all the different species responses. And I want to show it because it's complicated. So not all species respond necessarily the same. Different species start extending shoots earlier. Different species stop extending later. So it's really kind of species dependent and complicated. And now I'm going to pass it on to Lucia, and she's going to talk about the state of the practice, adaptation plantings in the Great Lakes, and some of those projects. So thank you, Lucia. I'll stop sharing.
Thanks, Jamie. Start sharing my screen. And hopefully you see the correct one and hear me okay. Great. So thanks, Jamie and Nate, for the introduction and for having me here. It's a pleasure for me to be here. Today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about my postdoc work, which is adaptation plantings in the Great Lakes region. I'm going to talk a little bit about motivation, state of the practice, like what's happening in the region, and then move on to a little bit of the projects, like some of the case studies. And I first want to acknowledge my research team, Rebecca, Brian, Tony, and Josh, who have helped a lot into the development of the project. And with that, well, Jamie explained this pretty well, so I'm going to run pretty quick on these. Pretty much forest habitats across the upper lake states are threatened by the impacts of an increasing frequency and severity of climate extremes and disturbances, including non-native insects and diseases. And from these disturbances, I want to point your attention to the famous emerald ash borer, as we can see in the top right of the screen, which is an overwhelming threat to forests in the Lake States region. Emerald ash borer, or EAB, has already invaded and transformed forests in much of Michigan, and now it's moving through Wisconsin and to the eastern side of Minnesota. So this is a big concern in the region, as we'll see along the presentation. So with that, given the cultural, ecological, and economic impacts of forest loss in the region, adaptation plantings or strategies are a key strategy. And because you're going to hear me talking a lot about adaptation plantings, I better define it. So for this study, adaptation plantings are plantings done with the goal of restoring and sustaining tree cover in vulnerable areas under uncertain future conditions. And this can include assisted migration techniques, ash under planting, range expansion, resilience strategies, etc. So there's many, many different strategies. And for this presentation, we're going to focus more on assisted migration, ash under planting, and a little bit about range expansion. So our objectives for our study were first to evaluate outcomes from forest adaptation plantings across a range of vulnerable forest ecosystems using already implemented forest adaptation experiments. So we did not go out and plant a new project. We actually were trying to figure out which projects were already on the ground and see what's happened with them in all the Great Lakes regions. And then for specific objectives, the first one was to assess, as I was mentioning, the state of the practice, what's happening. Or what's going to happen in the future, what organizations planning in the near future. And the second one, for some projects that we identify that meet our research interests, actually go to the project and measure growth and survival trends and see how species are surviving and what's the setup of these projects and experiments. With that, this map shows our study area. On the left one, we see the points, the location of the projects and their names. On the right side of the map, we see the same points, but the colors here represents the ownership of the land where the project is. So as we can see, most of the projects are green, which means they're in state lands. Mostly Minnesota and Wisconsin DNR are the ones doing this on the ground projects. But I do want to highlight some projects by the Nature Conservancy in Minnesota and Michigan that we're going to see later in the presentation. And here, for example, Tribal Nation projects. This one is for Fond du Lac Band. And there's also some county projects around the way. So there's different spread out of the projects that we could actually go and measure. There's more projects in the region, but there's just so much funding and time that we can go to. So those are the ones that we actually went. Come on, switch. There you go. All right, so now I'm gonna run quickly through the methods. I did both qualitative and quantitative methods. For qualitative methods, we did some surveys and informational interviews. And in the brackets here, you can see the number of responses we got. So we interacted with a bunch of stakeholders that wanted to participate and collaborate with us in different stages. And with that, we selected a more narrow group of participants for focus groups, in which we talked a little bit more about motivations for state of the practice, challenges, opportunities, and their specific situations. And we wanted to see the spread of opinions and what was happening within each institution. And again, the brackets are the number of participants here, and then the people that participated or the institutions they belong to. After doing all the surveys and interviews, we actually went to the field. So we coordinated with land managers to show us around their sites and to actually see what was happening on the ground. So this happened over the summer of 2020, 2021, 2022, mostly 2022, where we went out and saw the sites. And for the ones that we identified and matched closely our research objectives, we went back and measured them. And since by the photos, you might already be able to tell that each project has a very different shape, size, and structure. So I did two different sample design techniques, both transects or circular plots, depending on the shape and size of the project itself. In the area that's highlighted in red, we measured our seedlings of interest. So the seedlings that were intentionally planted to replace either ash that had some assisted migration component to them. So pretty much only our seedlings of interest in the areas in red. But then we also measured woody competition. We measured seedlings, saplings, and trees in the areas that I just showed up there. And here are some examples of the projects. So after measuring all of these projects, we separated them into different categories according to their main goal or objective. For climate change directly related projects, we measured 12 of them. And in the pictures here, we can see the name of the project, who was the one in charge of, and the year planted in brackets. And again, I want to point your attention to the differences within each project. Like there's differences in deer protection, for example. Some of them have deer protection, some of them don't have deer protection. And this particular one, Snake Creek, has been seeded. The rest have been planted. So there's differences on the ways the actors and stakeholders are actually doing these projects. The next category was ash underplanting projects, and we measured 7 of them. Again, very different ones here. I do want to highlight this particular project from a private landowner in Wisconsin who's planting bald cypress. Somehow this is becoming a trend, as some of the in Wisconsin, there's a couple of people that are starting to plant bald cypress from seed sources as south as Indiana. So it was surprising to see how so far it's doing really well, but of course it's too young to tell. So we'll see in a couple of years how these species are doing. Other projects I want to point out were the Fond du Lac Band project that is doing, again, adaptation plantings under ash stands, and then others by Carleton County or Wisconsin DNR. And finally, the other category was floodplain projects. These ones are a little older, as you can see in the year planted. So here the trees are a little taller. On the one on the right, we can see a clear example of how deer browse can actually alter our results and probably working against the seedlings. We can see here an elm, and on the right also an elm, both planted on the same year, but this one that I'm pointing out right now has been browsed constantly over and over the years. So it's like a bonsai shape. It was very hard to find those trees, but they're there. They're surviving somehow. And this one on the right somehow escaped the deer and was able to grow pretty well. So there's a lot of factors affecting these, not just climate and our area, but also external factors like browse, like disease, insects, etc., to take into account. So now let's look at some general trends of the state of the practice, what's happening in our region in general. Overall, we saw that tribal nations, Minnesota and Wisconsin DNR, have several on-the-ground projects, but they're on small areas. Just a couple hectares usually that they are experimenting on their lands to see what's happening and how species are doing. Michigan DNR, however, has still research, it's in the research phase of adaptation plantings and building capacity. They still don't have fully on-the-ground projects that we could identify. We might have missed some, but so far that was the trend that we found, that they're still building capacity, hiring more personnel to that's specialized in climate adaptation, and seeing how still being a little more cautious with the research phase before moving to the next step. The closest we could get to operational scale projects, I think, was from the Minnesota Nature Conservancy that has a lot of projects on the ground with the three categories that Jamie talked about: resistant, resilience, and transition projects in larger areas. A couple of those projects, they were more than 100 acres in size, so they were a little more operational level projects. Then we saw that partnerships within institutions exist, but it was pointed out several times by our collaborators that they actually want to increase these collaborations. That, for example, Wisconsin DNR was saying that they would feel more confident on experimenting for specific species if they knew that, for example, Minnesota DNR had already tried it out and worked. So like just by sharing the information, collaborating, it will give more support and more level of comfort in trying things out if they know that somebody else has already tried it. So collaboration was something pointed out as important. Then we found that there were provenance tests already in the region dating back to the 1950s, 1960s in the 3 states. So there's genetic information for different genotypes in the region that we can get information to select what type, to select our seed sources and what type of genotype we want to use in our specific site. Moving to policy now, I'm going to start with tribal nations. So as some of you might know already, tribes are sovereign nations. So each one have their own approach at climate change and EAB response. We cannot just put them all in one bucket and say tribes are doing this or that. They're very different situations, and we can see it a little bit in some of the examples that I'm going to show. However, we did find some overarching documents like the 1854 and the Gliffwick Climate Change Vulnerability Assessments. There's 2 different documents that try to identify vulnerability assessments in the region. And also there's the climate tribal adaptation menu as part of the NIAX adaptation workbook that I'm going to mention later. But there's some documents already existing with tribes to help inform climate change adaptation strategies. So something that we notice is that some tribal representatives that work for the natural resources offices for the tribe, they usually prepare a project and send it over to the tribal council for oversight and approval to make sure that the project aligns with the tribe's objectives. And then we saw that tribes are inherently striving to blend the best of available science with traditional ecological knowledge on the projects and try to think more holistically on a project, not just very narrowly minded. They want to see it more holistic. And with that, I want to point out 4 different bands that we talked to. Paukagon and Gun Lake, they share boundaries with the state of Michigan. So they're on the eastern side of the region where emerald ash borer already went through and shaped their forest tremendously. And black ash, as some of you might know, is a very culturally important tree for the tribe. And they actually use it for basket making and other things as well. So they were very interested in preserving their ash pretty much at all costs. So they started doing some chemical treatments, which of course increased the cost, but initially now they're more into a maintenance state, but they are pretty much injecting the trees with a chemical that pretty much prevents EAB to kill the tree. On the other side, Fond du Lac and Leech Lake, for example, these 2 bands share boundaries with the state of Minnesota. They're both doing some ash underplanting projects. And Leech Lake specifically also is working on some climate adaptation projects. And one that I'm looking more deep into is an Aspen project with between Leech Lake and the Chippewa National Forest. They're doing a collaborative project in which they're trying to, they've noticed they have too much ash in the stands, and they want to diversify the stand a little bit more, since ash is not expected, aspen is not expected to do very well in climate change. So there's different projects going around. And again, I want to point out each band is different. So there's going to be some differences around. Moving on to policy and documents, we saw that in general, these 3 states lacked formal organizational policy specific to adaptation plantings. This result can be that individuals within organizations are experimenting a little more informally with plantings based on their own experiences and level of comfort. However, still, these efforts are guided by strategic planning policies, like we can see in the Wisconsin DNR, that already account for some verbiage in climate change. And these policies detail overarching strategies for adaptation that provide direction for a particular program and for the desired future condition of the forest. Minnesota DNR, for example, has a little more specific operational orders, some of them in draft form that are starting to show some climate adaptation techniques. And then I wanted to point out at this document from the Superior National Forest, their Assisted Migration Plan, which is a guidance document to help the agency make decisions about assisted migration as an adaptation strategy. This policy is serving as a pilot for developing similar efforts in all U.S. national forests to provide pretty much consistent, informed, and coordinated assisted migration efforts. And as you can see from the box here, it's a very collaborative effort. So once it's ready, it's going to be a nice example for the rest of the institutions to follow. Now, when I move on to training tools, like how are people getting informed about these adaptation strategies? So some of them mentioned that they were just self-taught, look at the literature and get informed about what's happening, what's published. Another way that they can do it is demonstration areas like the ASK project that Jamie talked about, or from the Great Lakes Silviculture Library. They usually post a lot of projects or demonstration areas that include climate change. So this is a good resource to check out if you want to see some on-the-ground projects. A couple other tools to mention is the Climate Change Tree Atlas and the seed lot selection tool from the Forest Service. And NIAX, the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, has an adaptation workbook. And they do trainings on these at least once a year. And there's currently a training ongoing right now that I'm a part of. But this adaptation workbook pretty much allows a stakeholder to get a project that they're actually working on and run it through the adaptation workbook. And it's going to help you go over first your goals and objectives, identify the vulnerabilities, identify how aligned your objectives are with climate change, and then plan some actions and monitoring. So this is a very good tool. And if you haven't heard of it, I'll encourage you to check it out if you have a project that you would want to incorporate some climate change to it. And now I want to move on to highlights from on-the-ground projects before the end of the presentation. So some of the examples of the projects we measured. Again, here there's the 3 different categories that we classified our projects on. We see the 3 most abundant species in each category, and the percentage represents the number of trees measured in that category. So for ash underplanting, for example, swamp white oak was the most abundant one. For climate adaptation, red oak was the most abundant one, and for floodplains, American elm was the most abundant tree. And then moving on to a couple of case studies specifically. This one is the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, Black Ash Underplanting Project from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, planted in 2019 in the northern part of Wisconsin, as you can see in the map here. They have 10 different sites that I'm scrolling through my mouse with. And as you can see, there's different ecoregions that these projects or these stands fall into. I like their study design a lot. They divided them into stripes, 1 acre each one, and each color represents a different species. And they even tried 2 different strategies. They tried seeding and planting them. So for example, the green one, the top one would be a planted, and then the bottom one would be seeded. So then they can see the differences in growth between the two techniques. So these graphs show their survival results from the report in 2022. And from these, we see that the the three species that survived the best were swamp white oak, American elm, and yellow birch, which seem to be so far viable alternatives to plant in ash-dominated wetlands. However, again, I want to point out these are very young still, so there's a lot that could happen while these trees are growing, but it's a good start to look into these. And on the graph on the right, we can see the differences in harvested and non-harvested sites, because this project, out of the 10, it had some harvested sites and some non-harvested sites. So it's a very complete study that we were able to visit. For the next project I want to point out is the Two-Hearted Forest Reserve or Fish Camp by Michigan Nature Conservancy in the Upper Peninsula up here. So this is Lake Superior and this is in the Upper Peninsula. They planted all the plots here in 2020 and 2021. And let's look at some of their survival numbers. So for stand A that has 44 acres, they planted mostly red oak and black spruce, but the one we were interested in was the red oak since it came from southern Michigan. So their survival rate so far is 89% for those oaks. And for the younger stands, C, D, and E that have 80 acres, their survival was between 79 and 100%. So they're still doing pretty good. Again, we'll need to be patient and see how these trees respond, but so far so good. And the other one that I want to point out, and hopefully the video works. So this is Nerstrand Big Woods State Park. I want to point your attention to those little tubes, which contain the seedlings planted. And then as we move to the left, I want you to take a look at the canopy and how it goes from a forested area to pretty much like standing dead trees. And this was a very impressive project, at least for me, when I went there. And I'll show you here in the map. So here is the park. All these red areas are the areas of die-off. And I think there were about 200 acres that had experienced die-off from the last 10 years or so. On the rectangles here, we can see where the project is to try and plant these replacement species to see what was happening. And of course, the question I always get is like, what happened there? And what they think happened is over the past 10 years or so, there's been an increase in precipitation, which has created anaerobic conditions for the trees. So the roots of the trees are getting rotten and the tree just dies. So it's like a big magnitude. And if you haven't been to this area, I encourage you to do it. It's a live example of climate change. But they're doing a project in order to find replacement species, because guess what's coming back after these species die? It's ash. So that doesn't show a good future either. So they planted cottonwood, elm, hackberry, silver maple, and swamp white oak. And so far, elm, silver maple, and cottonwood are doing the best in survival, but hackberry and swamp white oak is still handling in there. And this is one of the few projects we actually could get growth data with, because we had information from the past. The figure on the left is for diameter. The figure for the right is in height. Cottonwood, elm are again the ones that have the highest growth, and the other three are still hanging in there. Hackberry is still the smallest one, so we'll see if in a couple of years how it does. And with that, I wanted to finish this with some take-home messages. What's successful? It's hard to tell right now, but for now, know your site ahead of time and determine what species could be successful, and see, get informed with some other demonstration areas and experiments of what has happened in there as well. Collaboration across agencies and institutions is key to be able to scale up adaptation plantings and share expertise on what's successful. Don't put all of your eggs in one basket. I'm sure you've heard that phrase before, and it also applies here. Plant the diversity of species, and what doesn't do very well, you have the other alternatives. There's a need to build a framework for operationalizing adaptation plantings and to respond to the question how to move forward. There's a lot of unknowns there too. And we saw that there was a disconnect between adaptation ideas and nursery capacity. Like, stakeholders and managers can have a lot of great ideas for adaptation plantings, but if the nurseries cannot keep up with that or don't have the correct stock, there's not much we can do about it. And scale matters for determining success, right? Right now we're looking at smaller projects, but whenever we scale it up, that success rate might change. And with that, just point out quickly some opportunities. Right now there's learning through regional collaboration was highlighted as a good opportunity. Adaptation and mitigation right now is a priority for the government, so it's something to take advantage of, and there's existing funding and incentives to take advantage of. Challenges, lots of unknowns. There's a lot of where to start kind of questions. It's expensive. I'm sure you know this. Planting is expensive. Adding deer protection is expensive. So there's a lot of that involved. And there's different resources allocated per division of the DNR. Too early to rule out success. Nursery capacity, we talked about that. And then, yeah, just include formal forest planning for scaling up. And there's different levels of comfort with people. And with that, I want to thank my funding from the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, again, my research team, and my many, many collaborators. There's more than 50 collaborators that help us out and made this project possible. So with that, thank you, everybody, and I'll pass it over to Nate.
Thank you. Thank you. Both Dr. Mosel and Dr. Fitz. I hope you can still hear me, right? Give me a thumbs up. All right, good stuff. We have about 5 minutes for some questions here to wrap things up. We have 3 questions in the hopper, but I would still invite others to feel free to tap in a question. The first is, I think was directed, Jamie, at you, but then Lucia, you sort of tapped into it too. And it is, broadly, what look to be like the climate winners if we're thinking about planting tree species? And Jamie, they asked you about northern Minnesota, but I think maybe we could look more broadly, Lucia, with your research. What do you think are coming up as some of the tree species we should be looking at?
I can start off just briefly for the Before Warmed experiment. So the data that I looked at was 11 different species. And among those, I think the question that I saw asked, besides maples are definitely doing really well. White pine tends to be an okay option. There are some issues like white pine blister rust that could be a concern. Another thing that we saw in, at least looking at shoots, was aspen and birch liked that longer season. So that could be something to consider, but those are also species that aspen, not always that desirable. We've got a lot of it. Birch has a lot of other climate change impacts. So I'll turn it over to Lucia because she's got a wider breadth of species in her projects.
Thanks, Jamie. I think I agree with white pine we saw in a couple of projects in Brainerd that was doing really well. Oaks were doing well as well. We saw red oak, swamp white oak was a new species that I found, new for me at least, but it was doing pretty well. Some site, it depends a lot on the site, of course, like in the Wisconsin Great Lakes Restoration Initiative that we saw the 10 different sites. The species success varied on the different type of sites and soil moisture and how much flooded the site was, etc., like Jamie also pointed out. So there's a lot. I don't think I can say this species is the winner for sure because it depends a lot on the site. But some of the trends we saw were that, yeah, oaks were doing great. Maple was doing well as well. We found silver maple was doing well. Trying to remember other species that were doing well, but pretty much, yeah, pines, oaks, maples were doing well. Hackberry still surviving, is tiny, but we'll see in a couple of years what happens as well. Some of projects I've heard it's not been a success. Some projects like still hanging in there, so we'll see.
Perfect. A second group of questions I'm going to sort of pull together a little bit. One person asked, if ash can survive climate change, it seems to me like we should plant more, at least until we get climate change under control. Someone else asked, with emerald ash borer in Minnesota, and again, Lucia, more broadly across the Midwest, how will that affect ash plantings being done in adaptation projects? So I think maybe talking a little bit about the state of ash and maybe clarifying a little bit about the nature of ash underplantings that I think you talked quite a bit about.
Yeah, I think I should have mentioned this, but ash under plantings, they're not planting ash in this, they're planting other species underneath ash canopy. I don't think any of the projects we saw were actually planting ash. They were trying to find alternative species that whenever that ash is expected to die from emerald ash borer or other similar conditions, then those species would be like ready to take over and actually control the hydrology of the sites. Like we don't want ash to disappear and then that site to get flooded and just come back with grasses. So the ash under plantings are really mostly finding other species that will grow in those ash stands once those fail. And the question for if ash can survive climate change, I think right now the big problem with ash is emerald ash borer, and like how we're seeing what happened in Michigan. That's the projection we're expecting in Wisconsin and Minnesota. So because of that concern, I think most of the landowners are trying to look at different species. I haven't checked on the climate tree atlas how ash is going to do with climate change specifically, but I think right now the big problem is emerald ash borer.
I was just going to throw in the chat, out east, there's been a lot of work looking at ash, more specifically brown ash and Wabanaki territory, that area of the Northeast. And so I'll pop a link in. Some of the things they've been doing might give ideas for what we could see here too, in addition to all of what Lucia said.
Perfect. And I will ask, looks like maybe we got another question too. So I want to ask one final question before we wrap up, and maybe it's a big one. You've talked about changing precipitation and going both ways, right? Jamie, you looked at drought. Lucia, you looked at drought, but you also talked about near strand where things were flooded. And then there's changing temperature. My question for you is, do you feel that one or the other of those is the predominant issue that we need to be paying attention to right now? Or, you know, are they combined in some way? Where do we focus our attention in the near future?
I'll take a shot first and then I'll hand it to Lucia. That's a big question. I really do think it's combined. So for example, we'll get a drought. And then the next year, maybe it's really wet. That promotes lots of pathogens. Fungus loves moist conditions. And then the tree's already weakened. So then that disease progresses more than it should have. We get a heat wave. The tree gets more stressed out. All these sorts of things. So I really think a lot of it's connected. In most cases, trees can be pretty hardy, but not against so many different things at once. And not against repeated stressors. So that's my perspective, especially as we see it is kind of a contradiction. You know, we're getting warmer, but and drier in some cases, we're getting wetter. That's hard for a tree to deal with so many different things.
Yeah, I think I agree with Jamie. Like right now, what we're seeing with climate change are extremes and on both sides. And I think that's the problem, going from like very warm to very cold, or the other way around, very dry to very wet. And like those extremes are what gets the tree a little bit more. And also like for disturbances, we're starting to think about compound disturbances. Jamie also mentioned these. So one disturbance after the other, like if the first disturbance didn't kill the tree, it already weakened it. And then the next disturbance come, which by itself maybe wouldn't have killed the tree, but it was already weakened. So these combinations are the ones that might be more harming to the tree. And for that, I think looking into the different tools that we have available today, like the Climate Change Atlas and all the different models, we can play around with the predictions and try and get a more informed approach there. And I encourage you to check the Climate Change Atlas and also the NIAX Adaptation Workbook. Those are good tools that we have. Now with technology, things get a little easier, but also there's a lot like that we can do there. So there's many, many options.
Perfect. Thank you both very much for the presentation today. I'm going to, for all of you, quickly start up a poll. We really take seriously your feedback to help us improve the webinar, and we would love to have your input on these 4 brief questions before you leave today, because we're finding that if we don't ask for your feedback before you leave, then it's unlikely that we'll get it. So please do stick around and answer these few questions. We'll leave it open until the webinar ends. And then in the meantime, I also will share my screen just one more time and offer a few quick final quips. One is, if you're not already a part of our mail list, please do sign up. This is the most important way that we share news and information about upcoming events and new resources with you. And we know that it is by far and away the best way that we have to let you know about opportunities like this webinar series. So you can scan the QR code or visit climate.umn.edu, scroll to the bottom of our page, and you can find a sign up there. Those are both really easy ways to sign up. And then the last update is that Jamie is working with me and others to start a new Community Climate Leaders program, which will broadly invite anyone in Minnesota who wants to be a part of contributing to our statewide climate action footprint to learn a little bit more about Minnesota's changing climate, about great solution strategies, about how to have conversations and how to work with others to take action. And then together, we'll work on increasing the climate action footprint in Minnesota. And so again, if you are interested in learning more about this program, you can scan the QR code or visit z.umn.edu Climate Leaders Interest. Sign up for the MCAP newsletter. Any of these things will enable you to learn more about the program. These links go to a short survey that that you can take to let us know that you're interested and share some feedback about how we can design the program to serve you well. So with that, again, I will ask one more time. It looks like we have 16 of 19 people left on the call who have completed the survey questions. Please do your best to answer the poll. And I want to again thank Dr. Mosel and Dr. Fitz today for joining us and sharing a little bit about their work on adaptive forest management and how we can be a part of maintaining resilient forests in the future with changing climate in Minnesota and across the Midwest. So thank you both. And with that, we'll stick around and just end the presentation shortly.